Merhaba, my name is Charles Mtakwa. I am Tanzanian and I am a PhD candidate in Dokuzelu University pursuing a PhD in International Relations, and I'm very happy to participate in this interview. Military intervention has negative impact towards democratic consolidation because for a country's democracy to be regarded as consolidated is when the current democratic system in the country becomes the only game in town, meaning that no one in the country is trying to act outside of the set institutions. So when a military intervene to oust the existing elected regime, it entails that alternatives other than those established through democratic institutions are sought in order to bring about the desired changes. So it goes against the very nature of a consolidated democracy. And also, the military has to be under the control of civilians. So when the military rise up to remove the civilian elected government, then it counters the very nature of democracy. So in essence, military intervention has negative impact towards democratic consolidation. So on free, fair, competitive, and regular election, again, military intervention has negative impacts because they often overthrow a legitimate government that came to power through popular election. So in essence, it removes people's choices. Through historical readings, the end result of such intervention, they tend to vary, especially in Africa. So in some cases, the coup leaders are removed from power by rivals. So there is another coup that often removes the coup leaders. But in other cases, the military went back to their barracks, leaving a political sphere to civilians. But even in such cases, the threat of another intervention never stays far away. There is a tendency for it to recur again. And in most African cases, and this has been the tendency from 1990s onwards, those who assumed power through coup often civilianized their status. So they took off their uniforms and they held election in order to legitimize their status as head of states. So this leads to a hybrid regime where these leaders, they tend to use democracy to conceal the autocratic nature of their regime. So it's not a democracy, is an autocracy, but portrayed as a democracy. But all in all cases, the political culture of a country that experiences a military intervention is irrevocably altered. And a noticeable or notable characteristic of military coup is that with almost every coup, there is a subsequent counter coup. So it tends to recur. And once a military violates the very tenet of their role in society, where armies are supposed to be subordinate to state, the original intention, or the original intervention rather, sets off a chain of reaction. So a good example of this can be in Turkey, where after the coup in 1960s, there was a chain of reaction where led to other coup in the future. But for my continent is Benin. It got independent in 1960s. In 1963, the government was deposed in a coup that was led by the army's chief of staff. Although a civilian was elected president in a year later, that is in 1964, in 1965, the military again assumed power. 2 years later, a rival faction within the army took power, only to see their nominated president overthrown in 1969. Presidential elections were held in 1970, but they were abandoned, and in 1972, a middle-ranking officer seized power, only handing over to civilian rule in 1991. So there is a tendency for coup to resurge once it happens. Thus violating free and fair election. Leaders, even if they get elected, there is a tendency for them to be removed, and so it hampers the very nature of democracy. On civil liberties, well, upon assuming power, coup leaders typically make media commitments to respect civil liberties. They also make a commitment to promote economic development, lay a solid foundation for the return of democracy, and so on and so forth. Such pledges often initially sway public opinion, especially those who are uneducated and illiterate, who tend to view the military as a savior, as some kind of a messiah. So often the military, they capture radio and TV stations, and that is usually their first priority of coup leaders who intend to gain or to reassure the public of such matters. However, launched to improve public order, efficiency, and end corruption, these coup often brings no fundamental shift in the structure of power. So again, the impact varies based on the nature of such interventions. There are some interventions that are popular to the civilians, among the civilians. These are those which are embarked on to supplant a government that deemed to be unable or unwilling to preserve the state from internal or external problems. So these coups often become popular at first. The other types, they are less popular than this. For example, the coups which are motivated by ambitious individuals who often utilize the military to capture power. These often they provide rewards to the few essential cronies at the expense of the civilians. So civilians, they actually they don't get the right, and the policies are not directed towards enabling them, but rather to enable and to enrich the military that is in power, or that keeps the regime in power. And the most destructive are those interventions which the military makes a move to prevent mass participation and social mobilization. These tend to be the worst kind because many civilians may be killed. However, identifying the real motives behind the coup plotters is extremely difficult, given that all of them, they justify their actions with reference to national interest. So often, only a retrospective analysis may help to explain what led to the intervention. In any event, it is also likely that the motives and the intentions, or what the coup leaders hope to achieve, change over time, and in some cases quite rapidly. But quite often, all military intervention, they tend to infringe civil liberties. Well, on political rights, by definition, a military regime is built on force and coercion. So does a military intervention. So they're built on force and coercion rather than consent. So militaries are not democracy, but deeply hierarchical institutions characterized by essentially dictatorial norms. So by their very modus operandi, means of operation, they are incompatible with constitutional democracy. So as a result, when the military seize power, two dominant factors they tend to shape their time in power. First is their need to dominate civil society. So alternative voices or passive sides of opposition, they are often not allowed by such regimes, which means they tend to perceive opposition as insubordination. So people's rights to speak, they're often suppressed. Second is the desire to secure military's power base. They tend to engender a strong dictatorial attitude. So in order to remain in power, they tend to be quite dictatorial. They suppress people's right of opinion and expressions, and only the thing that, or only the message that they want to be heard is the one that will be allowed to be voiced while suppressing opposition. So again, military interventions, they tend to suppress people's political rights, freedom of expression, and other political rights of the citizens are suppressed as On horizontal accountability, well, military regimes, they tend to have a contempt for the law, and they quickly degenerate into simply staying in power, perceiving themselves to be above the legal constraints. So in such circumstances, there is little accountability or respect for the citizen's right. Since the ultimate authority on the legality of government action lies not with the courts, but with the military. So in any case, law processes and institutions of rights are severely restricted, often under what they often term states of emergency. So typical events surrounding coup include the constitution being suspended, political parties being disbanded, civil liberties being severely circumscribed. Now, all these herald the military's desire to neutralize constraints on the exercise of state power. So again, we see negative impacts stemming from such intervention. On the impact of military interventions on effective power to govern, well, overall, military interventions and rule, they tend to severely damage the polity. Citizens who do not submit or align themselves to the military are often shut down from the nation's economic and social activities as well as political activities. On the other hand, those who are loyal and support the military can significantly enhance their political career and career in general, and they can generate considerable wealth. There are many examples from Africa, but I'd like to draw one of the worst examples in Nigeria, where Sani Abacha, who led the military coup and who controlled Nigeria from 1993 to 1998, he looted the country where up to $4 billion in foreign assets were traced to him, his family, and their representatives when he died. Now, other military rulers have been perhaps less ambitious, but looting the state has been a feature of most army regimes, notwithstanding the fact that upon assuming power, reigning in corruption and promoting good governance was ostensibly the main reason why the military intervened. But when they come into power, they end up actually being more corrupt, dwindling the country's resources, make it even harder for a civilian regime that will come into power next to govern effectively.